Hello, welcome to this first edition of the leadership discussion of the Committee for the Republic of Canada. I'm Jean-Philippe Lebleu, member activist for the CRC. I'm with Robert Hux, also member of the CRC, but also correspondent for the 21st Century Science and Technology magazine. So today we wanted to discuss something regarding economics, or let's say real economics, and wanted to use actually something that just happened February 13th in Canada, where the House of Commons unanimously, surprisingly enough, passed a law called C-383, which is another one of those laws that aims at preventing the import of water from Canada to the United States. Now, everybody's usually agree this is beautiful, we're protecting our wetlands and everything. But what we're going to try to do here today is actually to demonstrate that not only is this law insane, but what is it exactly that we have to do as Canadians, but also as citizens of this world, in order to get out of this imperial system, which is actually right now in a state of collapse. And we're going to go through some of that. But I think it's important for Canadians to realize that here in this country, a lot of people are actually controlled by two sides of the same British imperial coins. On one side, you have the environmentalists, who actually represents a policy of depopulation. So this whole hoax of overpopulation. So stopping any kind of projects that could occur in the country, that's their role. And on the other side, you have this free trade, resource grab, that people associate with the Conservative Party, that just, sells away the natural resource and, again, does not create any kind of real internal development, of real economic development. It's simply selling something to get some money back. But as we'll see today, and as we know already, the situation is such that the whole system of money per se is crumbling. So we have to get back to what actually a sound conception of economics. So we've got to get rid of those two things, this idea of just resource grab, selling it for a quick profit, and this other crowd of representing what's called green fascism. So complete block of any sort of significant development based on this idea of the hoax of overpopulation, which different groups like Greenpeace, the World Wildlife Fund, or individuals like the very Malthusian David Suzuki. So yes, actually what's happening now, what we're going to talk about, there are certain things that our viewers are already aware of. I think everybody has heard about this banking collapse that we are into internationally. It's also in Canada. It's more obvious in Europe and the United States, where you have a imperial banking system. Those too big to fail banks, they're just crashing, and they're forcing nations to bail them out, which means more austerity on this country. I think Greece is a very clear example, with rising unemployment, rising suicide rate. This is like insane. This is really this is the end. This is the danger of seeing nations disappear. So there's this happening, but one thing we're going to focus a bit more, and I'm going to let Robert here speak, is that we want to talk to you about the actual food crisis occurring right now throughout the world.
Yeah, I'll just refer to an article that appeared in the Executive Intelligence Review, February 22nd, by economics editor Marcia Mary Baker, called "Restore National Sovereignty, End Famine Depopulation Agenda," which people can see on our EIR website. And what Marcia Mary Baker goes through is that we're facing an unprecedented food crisis, which is creating the conditions for a global famine, which, unlike past food crises that people can think of in the last 50 to 100 years, is actually also threatening famine inside the United States itself, the world's leading exporter of food. And I just want to take out a couple of elements that Marcia develops in this paper that people should go to for more detail on this. First, that the world production of grains of all types has been stagnating. As 2010, we were talking about 2,200 million metric tons of grains being produced. And what's now being forecast, hopefully, for the 2012-2013 harvest is 2,240 million metric tons of grains. So this is not even keeping up with population growth. Now, in the United States, you have a similar, even worse pattern in terms of grain production in the United States, where as of 2010, the United States produced almost 400 million metric tons of grains. And the expected harvest for this coming year, 2012 into 2013, has collapsed by about 10% to about 350 million metric tons. And we know that Canada is the number 2 wheat exporter globally, and Canada fits into this pattern of not increasing wheat production or other food export production to keep up with this collapse that's occurring otherwise. And then the second thing I wanted to focus on from Marcia's paper is the situation with respect to hunger. Globally, you're talking about 1 billion people out of 7 billion people on the planet going hungry. And the figure inside the United States, which is quite shocking if you think about it, that this is the world's biggest food exporter, is that 48 million Americans are now dependent on food assistance. The program set up by the United States Department of Agriculture, the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or what's called food stamps. Now, the figure for Canada in terms of hunger inside Canada is about 10% of the Canadian population going hungry. So this fits in also with this global pattern. Now, there's a lot more description of the various other aspects of the food crisis globally, and particularly focusing on the United States, that you can get from Marcia's article. I want to just go through a quick overview of some of the causes of this food crisis, and therefore why this bill that was just enacted by the House of Commons, Bill C-383, which just briefly what it does is it prevents the construction of dams, reservoirs, canals on any rivers inside Canada for the purpose of diverting water into international rivers that would flow into the United States for the purpose of increasing water exports to the United States. This has now been passed by the House of Commons. It's gone through the first reading successfully by the Canadian Senate. It can be stopped, and it must be stopped at the Senate, and that's only going to happen by a big mobilization across Canada to realize that this is not about protecting our water. It is, in fact, about implementing a policy of genocide, which will affect also people in Canada. So just briefly, what you have is a series of developments. This shift towards away from a physical economy in terms of what you have to produce for your population in terms of agriculture, industrial production, the maintenance of infrastructure to support a growing population. The shift towards the idea that, that markets and money are the measure of an economy. And the turning point for this was in August of 1971 with the destruction of the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate monetary system. And subsequently also the elimination of what's called parity pricing for agriculture, where farmers in the United States, but there were similar programs in Canada and other countries around the world, some of which still exist to a small degree, where you're guaranteeing the farmer the ability to produce what is required in terms of the food supply, and at the same time you're guaranteeing that the people of the nation have a stable supply of food. So this has been taken down largely since the early 1970s. Secondly, there's been a series of measures that have been implemented going back to 1971, in some cases even earlier, to attack national sovereignty. That nations should have the control over their own food production. From the period 1986 to 1994, you had the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, who under the slogan, "One World, One Market," basically forced national governments to give up their control over maintaining agriculture, get rid of tariffs that would protect the agricultural producers from cheap food that could be dumped in your country and bankrupt your farmers, getting rid of the control over banking, a series of measures like this. 1994, people know that we had the North American Free Trade Agreement that went into effect, so that what I'm going to describe now occurring inside the United States directly affects Canada, because we're part of the same market for food as you have in Mexico, United States, and Canada. It's one market under the NAFTA. In 1995, you had the establishment of the World Trade Organization that again launched an attack against a nation having control over policies for maintaining agriculture, and insisting on such insane measures as nations not being allowed to maintain food reserves, that this would be distorting to the markets. Then finally, in 1999, the destruction of what's called Glass-Steagall, which was Franklin Roosevelt's 1933 Banking Act, which had a complete separation between commercial banking, which was regulated by the United States government, and commercial banks were not allowed to take bank deposits and invest them in speculative investments. Now, this was the policy in the United States up until 1999, when it was destroyed. Other countries around the world, including Canada, had similar policies. Canada's policy was actually taken down earlier than in the United States. And then there was a move towards just opening up for just speculative bubbles being blown. And then 1 year later, you had the Commodities Futures Modernization Act in the United States go through, which essentially allowed for unregulated speculation on futures of commodities, including food. So today, I just wanted to emphasize that agriculture and food production is no longer largely in the control of national governments that have any concern with whether their people have food to eat. It's in the hands of a British, European oligarchical faction. These are the people that run the food cartels like Cargill, Archer Daniel Midlands, Bunge, a series of food processing companies, the people who have control over international banking. And these are the people that in the 1930s developed the whole race eugenics movement that was put off to a show globally in Hitler's Germany in the 1930s into 1940s. And this is the philosophical faction behind today's green movement and environmentalist movement. It's precisely this idea of depopulation. So I just wanted to stress that this is the faction that as soon as World War II is over, you had United States that had Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was committed to a policy of national development, collaboration with other nations around the world in terms of economic development. That whole orientation went out the window with Harry Truman coming in, and the Wall Street crowd was allied much more tightly with Churchill in Britain. And in that context, you had a series of organizations that were set up in the United States and elsewhere around the world. The Conservation Foundation in 1946, the World Wildlife Fund in 1961, established by Prince Philip and Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. Then 10 years later, you had the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands of International Importance established. And this was used as a battering ram against the development of agriculture, development of farming, to say that you could not have large-scale water management projects of the type that we're going to be talking about shortly with the North American Water and Power Alliance, because that would disrupt wetlands, things like marshes. And that we should preserve marshes. We should, actually create more of them, according to these people.
So if we go back to this bill, this C-383, and look at this in the context of what you just enumerated about this, all these attempts to actually destroy food production, destroy projects that would bring this food development. So what's the situation today?
Yeah, what we have now, if you look, for example, at the situation in the United States in terms of drought, we know we've had a very severe drought, the most severe drought in the last 50 years, hitting most of the continental United States. In the southwestern, the central part of the United States. Last harvest, you had the corn and other crops that were severely depressed by the lack of water for agriculture. As of mid-February, the U.S. National Weather Service is forecasting that there's no heavy rains or snow coming that would actually interrupt that perspective. So this is hitting the farm belt at a time where you have the production of hay, the production of soybean, which is the feed for cattle and other livestock being threatened. The winter wheat crop is being threatened by this. Now, in Canada, in the last couple of years, the Canadian prairies, where you have 90% of all the wheat that's produced in Canada is grown, and again, Canada is the #2 wheat exporter in the world. In the last couple of years, the prairies have not been dry, they've been abnormally wet. But if you go back only to 2009, this area suffered the worst drought in many decades. And so this question of water management on a continental scale is put on the table. Precisely what this bill C-383 declares is not supposed to happen.
Yes, so if you have, I think you made the point a bit earlier that if you stop water projects, like in North America, for example, it is going to create conditions for starvation and famine in the world, right? The United States, I think produces 30% of the world's corn. So with policies like ethanol or this idea of forbidding water to cross a border, knowing the potential of this continent, then you're dealing with imperial attempt to starve a population. And it's a direct attack on a productive area. Some of our friends in Australia have talked about their own case with the Murray-Darling Basin region, which is actually a region where 40% of the farms are in that region. There's 75% of the irrigated crop. This feeds 30% of the population of Australia, which is 22 million, plus another 50 or 60 million people outside this country. So what happens if you prevent that area to use irrigation and you say, well, we're going to save wetland? You're going to kill people. This is the declared intention. And there's actually something that you've talked about in one of our LaRouche show a couple of weeks ago, that actually in the South Saskatchewan river system, there's actually a situation which is similar to what's happening in Australia.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. I mean, what you have, as I say, that what we're going to describe shortly is the solution to this, which is the North American Water and Power Alliance, that the fact that this has not gone ahead, that this has been blocked. You have the Saskatchewan River Basin that produces 80% of food production for Canada, has not had the construction of dams and the development of water resources either within the basin that is possible, or more significantly, the building of dams and water diversions into that basin from other basins as proposed by the North American Water and Power Alliance that I'm going to describe shortly. So what you've had is a series of measures inspired by this pseudo-environmentalist green agenda that is saying, okay, there's not enough water in the South Saskatchewan River Basin. Now this is the area in Alberta, the South Saskatchewan River Basin has the most intense irrigation development anywhere in Canada, in 13 irrigation districts. In Saskatchewan, you have a smaller amount of irrigated agriculture, but still quite significant. So under this Prince Philip World Wildlife Fund, the Ramsar Convention of Protecting Wetlands, what's been put forward is that there's not enough water to continue to allocate water resources either to agriculture or anything else. So as of March of 2005, there's been a cap put on water, increasing water allocations within the South Saskatchewan River Basin. And as also in the case in the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia, what they're now doing is they've set up a water market, and they say, well, this farmer is not using all of his water. He should have a right to sell his water or sell the water license itself. Now, you and I attended a conference in Quebec City several months back where someone who was involved in trying to peddle that policy, both in Australia and within the prairie provinces in Canada, ran into the fact that it's not a very popular policy. And he had to admit that this was not a very popular policy, not only for the farmers that are being denied the water that they need to grow food, but he had to admit that this policy was even being rejected by other people that you would think should be beneficiaries of this water, including municipalities. So that he's sort of confronting the fact this is not a popular policy.
Yeah.
And that what people were essentially saying is that there should be more water available. The emphasis should be on food production, but the question is, let's make more water. Let's not shut down the ability for maintaining human life.
So if you look at, again, I think if we go back to this rule, this C383, which is actually, when you look at it, it's actually it's anti-Canadian in its essence, because Canada did not develop itself. I mean, it's not David Suzuki who built Canada. It's not his ideology of population reduction and protecting frogs and protecting wetlands. It's actually a very active and very intelligent and optimistic population that had to build build a society in a very hostile environment. And we can look at projects. I mean, people know about the St. Lawrence Seaway project that was done in the 1950s, which was actually a joint project with the United States. We put our differences aside and we made a beautiful project. We also have during the famous Dirty 30s, where there was a very common problem where the very high quality land was being wiped out by this drought, which almost destroyed the whole region. So there was an effort from both sides of the border to actually deal with this Dirty 30s and make sure that the center of North America will actually become a very highly productive area. So, and there's another project that you've actually worked on, which was W.C. Bennett's two-river policy in British Columbia, which is another one of those very great example.
Yeah, I mean, this is very significant. We wrote up the story on this that people can find on the CRC website in the most recent issue of our magazine, The Canadian Patriot. And it describes that what people who follow the LaRouche movement are aware of as this North American Water and Power Alliance proposal, which I'm going to get to shortly, is not simply something that's coming from the United States. It's something that is coming from the United States under an environment in which there is a very receptive environment for this inside Canada. And so the story that we looked at is that the British Columbia Premier W.A.C. Bennett, who was in power from 1952 to 1972, he was very interested in developing the hydroelectric power on the Columbia River, which the Americans were interested in at that point. But he had a somewhat different perspective than a lot of people in the United States who were looking at, in terms of a narrow focus, looking at the Columbia River per se. So the issue is that during winter time, the Columbia River has much reduced flows during winter because a lot of the water is tied up in ice and snow. And you have much greater flow, obviously, during the spring into the summer months. So the Americans were interested in developing dams on the upper Columbia River in British Columbia to store water during the spring and summer months that could be released during the winter to increase hydroelectric production at the U.S. generating stations in the Northeast. So W.A.C. Bennett was interested in doing that, but he was also at the same time interested in doing something that everybody around him said it cannot be done, it's impossible, because at the same time that he would be building these dams in British Columbia on the Columbia River system, he was determined that the Peace River was also going to have a hydroelectric development. And this area, which if you look at a map of British Columbia, it's an area which at that point was hardly anybody lived there. and it was sort of out in the middle of nowhere. So he wanted to do these two things at the same time. So that what happened, this is a longer story, I'm not going to go into all the details right now, people can read about it on in the Canadian Patriot, but the Columbia River Treaty is signed between President Eisenhower and Prime Minister John Diefenbaker in 1961, but nothing happens in terms of going ahead and building it for another 3 years, because as far as Ottawa was concerned, the Columbia River Treaty meant that we're going to be building these dams on the upper Columbia River, which is going to increase hydro generation in the United States. Part of the Columbia River Treaty included the idea that the increased benefits for building these dams in British Columbia should be equally shared between Canada and the United States. Mm-hmm. So the argument, however, was, what does that mean? As far as Ottawa was concerned, sharing the benefits of building these dams in British Columbia, which would be an increased hydroelectric generation at these generating stations in the Northeast, that meant that that British Columbia's share of the electricity being generated in the Northeast of the United States should be sent back into British Columbia, where the electricity should be used there. But this is not something that W.A.C. Bennett wanted to hear, because he, at the same time, wanted to develop the Peace River, and so he couldn't do both the Columbia River and the Peace River unless he could create the circumstances under which he could allow that to go ahead. So it's a longer story that involved Bennett actually taking over the private utility and creating a provincial government controlled what's now BC Hydro, and creating the conditions where 3 years later, W.A.C. Bennett essentially could control the conditions under which this treaty would be implemented, so that he could jointly go ahead with developing the Columbia River and the Peace River. So that's something that people should look at, because if you look at the North American Water and Power Alliance, these two rivers, the Columbia River and the Peace River, are sort of linchpins for the project, because the Columbia River involves this is the river from which you're going to direct water into the United States using the Rocky Mountain Trench as a reservoir system. And the Peace River is the river from which you divert water into areas like the Saskatchewan River Basin, where you need water not only for agriculture for Canada, but this is going to be the area through which water flows into the Red River Basin and into areas such as North Dakota, South Dakota. Okay, areas that need water. But this is proposing something exactly in the opposite direction of what has been now passed by the House of Commons with this Bill C-383, which says you're not allowed to build a dam or a canal or a reservoir on a river if that is to increase the water flow into the United States. And that was a bill that was passed in the House of Commons. It has not yet been entirely passed in the Canadian Senate. That was passed after another more draconian bill had been defeated, which would have taken the additional step of saying you're not even allowed to divert water from one river basin inside Canada to another river basin inside Canada, like as I'm talking about. So the other thing that you could focus on is that so you had this fight in British Columbia, okay, the Bennett, who was totally open to this idea of a project such as NAWAPA, although as far as I'm aware, he never came out and endorsed the policy per se, but the environment was definitely there for something like this to happen. And in the same period where this North American Water and Power Alliance was put on the table, from the mid-1960s until the early 1970s, you see an extraordinary study done by the Saskatchewan-Nelson River Basin. Now, this is the river basin that collects the runoff off the eastern coast of the Rocky Mountains and delivers it eventually into the Hudson's Bay. So it's a huge river basin, includes the Red River Basin that has its origin in the United States. So what is done by this Saskatchewan-Nelson Basin is they call upon this Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Organization, administration, that was involved in the 1930s trying to fight the drought in the prairies, that was involved in constructing reservoirs and dams in these areas, to actually do preliminary engineering studies on 55 new dams, okay, either inside this Saskatchewan-Nelson Basin or outside of the basin for the purpose of diverting water into the Saskatchewan-Nelson Basin, and that they do an extensive study to answer the question, how much water could become available if we were to build a system. And this is done within the context that there is no identifiable reason as far as that they could state for why this water would be made available, but the question is, if we did this, what would we do? So the obvious question to ask is, why would they be doing a study like that? So obviously this is in the period in which the North American Water and Power Alliance was on the table, very much interest in these questions in Canada, and what basically we're looking at now is a situation where that's what has to be put on the table now in terms of a policy.
Yeah, because when we talk about this North American Water and Power Alliance, which, where we take these enormous amount of water from Alaska, Yukon, all this water that runs out in the ocean, runs off in the ocean, which is unused, to use that water to actually transform the whole biosphere of the continent. Canada, the United States, the western part of the United States, the whole region of Canada, and the north of Mexico. But in order to do it, and I think that's the important part here, in order to accomplish this, we're going to need to reactivate every aspect of our economy, from steel production, railroads, geology, dam building, nuclear power. So all this is being reactivated, talking about millions of very high-level productive jobs, right? In a joint project where the United States and Mexico will have the same stimulation of their economy, their real physical economy.
Right.
So a bill like C-383, which sounds a bit almost like anecdotal, everybody says, yeah, that's fine. Canadians like their water. Well, that's not true, because we let it go run into the waste. So we're not using it. We're just saying it's this very romantic, very green, idiotic conception of water. Right. Water is there, don't touch it. It's beautiful. Let it run in the ocean, while you could actually feed so many more millions of people with a project like NAWAPA. So you have that as a project that can actually get us out of this food crisis, get us out of the economic meltdown that we're in. But at the same time, I think what we have to look at is the fact that mankind as a whole must start to look forward, to look into the future. And that's what Lyndon LaRouche was talking about in his speech on February 22nd, last Friday, where he answered a question about this food crisis, where Jason Ross elaborated a bit on Marcia Mary's paper. And his answer was, all right, well, let's deal with those asteroids and meteorites that are looking after us and maybe try to hit us, because I think everybody heard this meteorite that blew up in the sky of Russia actually reactivated a lot of people saying, hey, actually the real environment in which we're in is not simply the Earth itself, but it's the whole solar system, which is actually a very, very hostile region. And when you look, again, if you go back to NAWAPA, the North American Water and Power Alliance, you have a project there that can actually put the foundation for you to be able to terraform a planet like Mars, knowing that it seems that there's been former rivers on Mars. There's a lot of unanswered questions, but the fact that mankind can go out there and bring a real biosphere, a real life to those planets, I think is the way to think about economics. So all these talks about no project, when you have resource grab on one side and green ideology on the other side, you're going into a dead end. Actually this is going to kill a lot of people. So maybe as a conclusion, in order to actually get to what we're talking about, in order to start the NAWAPA project, which is an essential project for Canada, the United States, and Mexico, a real project in the tradition of Canadian development, and also to actually, that's maybe another broader question, but to get back into space, to deal with this threat of meteorites and asteroids, there are certain first steps we got to do. And the first step is the Glass-Steagall legislation must be passed in Canada, the United States, and other countries in order to reorganize the banking system. There's a fight already in Italy, France, Great Britain, Sweden, other countries. They're proposing concrete laws to clean up the mess, which also probably will help us clean other things like getting rid of things like the World Trade Organization, which is part of the problem for this food crisis. And the other aspect of this will also be how we're going to finance those projects. Well, you got to go back to the idea of a national bank, a bank that will emit credit in a Alexander Hamiltonian way. So the first Treasury Secretary of the United States. So based on his idea of a banking system to finance projects like NAWAPA, and to go back to a real tradition of nation building and developing our population, which is in a very bad situation now, and to actually look to have a future for the next 50 to 100 or 200 years. And I think on this, we would like to invite our viewers to join us, to contact us on our website, committeerepubliccanada.ca, to give us a call, 514-461-7209, and get active with us. We've got this Glass-Steagall to pass. We have actually also a bill to stop in the Senate. People can join us to stop this, and then we can make sure that Canada has a future. So on this, thanks for watching, and see you soon.